For me, the key question about the United States emerging from the Civil War is how a country so utterly transforms itself.
How have the lives of Americans changed, right? Dramatically so.
What are we becoming? What do we want to be? What can we be?
If we looked at the United States at the end of the Civil War now, we would think of it as what we call an underdeveloped country. And the real question is how we got from there to here.
We need to understand how our economy grew to be the biggest and most productive and prosperous in the world.
The way in which industrial capitalism has unfolded.
How we decided to divide the pie, what kinds of decisions we made about capitalism, about distribution, about the rights of labor.
Who had power in the society, economic power, political power, cultural power.
And the way that power has been challenged by other social groups that have been more excluded from power.
How people in the past struggled to make things at least as good as they are today.
Struggled to become included and in the process have changed the nation.
All of American society, white and black, different ethnic groups, different social classes, were going to have to struggle over what the meaning of freedom was.
That in some ways turns into a question about who gets to be defined as an American and who doesn't, and who does the defining.
Who are Americans? What does it mean to be an American?
I think a major theme is the evolution of America's relationship with the wider world.
How does the United States become this global power?
And how does that affect our sense of what it means to be an American?
Maybe one would want to look at our notion of our own exceptionalism.
This idea that we are a special people who formed ourselves on a city on a hill, it seems presumptuous. And yet there's much good in that notion of a people who are making history rather than being imprisoned in it.
I would like to have questions about why this matters, why a historical understanding matters.
If we had to distill it to one thing, it's to remember the very vital presence of the past in contemporary American life, how it shapes the decisions we make and the options that present themselves to us. I think that's the central lesson we want to look at.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The end of the Civil War set the stage for a new era in American history.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
The triumph of northern industrial capitalism over the rural agricultural South unleashed a period of unprecedented economic growth that would forever alter the way Americans lived and saw the world. Nearly 4 million new citizens, formerly slaves, now struggled for a foothold in a society still largely closed to them. Meanwhile, an ever-increasing flood of immigrants exerted new pressures on a nation that both welcomed and excluded them. The grand experiment, as some refer to American democracy, continued to challenge and enlarge Americans' notions of freedom, equality, and identity.
From the founding, pretty much, we had a huge population of very different people, different interests, different regional interests, different class interests, and obviously very deep divides based on race and national origin. So to talk about American identity, it's much more accurate, I think, to talk about American identities, plural.
The question of what American identity was in 1876, what America stood for, has very different answers depending on if you are an Indian person undergoing the conquest in the West, if you're a Mexican originating person whose status or family status was changed to Mexican American and resident of the United States in 1848, whether you were a freedman hoping for rights and even hoping for land and economic opportunity, and in only very rare cases getting that.
Of course, regional identity exists in great measure. The war is still a very painful memory for many people, and the consequences of adjusting to the economic transformation that the war brought created enormous subjective differences among people in different parts of the United States.
For Americans of all races and regions, freedom was a cherished ideal, but freedom meant different things to different people.
There are always more than one definition of freedom in existence at any time and competing with each other. In 1876, freedom had, because of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, freedom had been exalted as the key national principle of American life. And with freedom came this new conception of the rights of American citizenship and of a national government empowered to protect the rights of citizens over and above violations by the states. At the same time, a very different vision of freedom is growing in importance among many thinkers who argue that freedom really means that you let nature take its course, and those who get ahead are the fittest, and those who fall behind, that's their own fault.
The relationship between freedom and equality has always been one in which people have argued you have to give up a little of one to get the other. And in some sense, that relationship has been a creative relationship, a relationship filled with creative tension.
Freedom and equality sometimes work together and sometimes work at odd purposes. We think of freedom in some respects as equally shared, but clearly it's not, and the dominant groups in the society have a great deal more freedom, and one of the ways in which that expresses itself is a resistance to equality.
If you think freedom means the right of people to act without outside constraint, well, that often produces lack of equality. And often people feel that if you want to promote equality, you have to limit freedom. You have to limit the freedom of entrepreneurs to exploit their workers. You have to limit their freedom to simply to spoil the environment. So there is a tension between freedom and equality.
One might want to say that this is a period of giant hopes for equality, but of much less realization of those hopes.
One morning in May 1876, reporters gathered outside the Vanderbilt home in New York City, waiting for a sign that railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt had passed away. Rumors ran rampant. The Commodore was dead. The stock market plunged. The Commodore was still alive. Wall Street rallied. Finally, Mrs. Vanderbilt invited the reporters into the parlor. From upstairs came the unmistakable voice of the old man himself.
I am not dying!
My great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, from what I know about him, he must have been a pretty tough sort of period person of that time and that character, because they were very tough-minded business people.
The Commodore was definitely an American original. He was a very rough-hewn character. He grew up on a small farm in Staten Island off of Manhattan, and his family was very poor. When he was 15, he went out and bought this old scow, an old wooden boat with one sail that could also be rowed, and he started taking passengers back and forth to Manhattan, 5 miles across New York Harbor, for 18 cents a trip.
It took about 8 or 10 hours to be able to get produce from the farmland around to Manhattan, and by taking this ferry straight across the inlet there, he was able to cut the time down and make 4, 5, 6 trips a day. He definitely knew his business. He understood competitive advantage.
Eventually, he was able to build up a fleet of steamships. And by the time he was in his mid-40s, he had made about $10 or $11 million. When the Commodore died, he died at the age of 83. He was the wealthiest man in the country. In fact, he had more money than there was in the United States Treasury.
There has never been in the history of civilization a period or a section of the earth in which science and invention have created such opportunity for material welfare as in these United States in the period since the end of the Civil War.
The United States has a series of advantages that allow it to undergo tremendous growth at the end of the Civil War. And first of all is the most obvious one, but it's often neglected, and that's agriculture. The South producing, I think, 5 times as much cotton in 1900 as it was in 1860 before the Civil War. The wheat production of the North quadruples.
The United States, by the late 1800s, is a continental nation spanning from sea to sea. Large amounts of arable land of high quality in the interior for agricultural development, large amounts of water resources, lumber, coal, and other fuels, and in addition, a climate and a topography, a landscape that allows not only for rapid agricultural development, but for rapid urbanization, articulation of transportation and communication networks. All of these things make for rapid industrial development and economic growth.
Another component, and a very basic one, is the tremendous growth in population. The population of the United States nearly doubles between 1870 and 1900. And what this allows is this new labor force, which is overwhelmingly young. It's not as if American workers are that much more productive, though they are, especially in agriculture, but there's so many more of them. And there's also so many more consumers that come in at the same time.
Nations of the earth creep at a snail's pace. The Republic thunders past with the rush of the express.
The railroad is really America's first big business, and as the railroad pushes west, we see settlement going up along the tracks, we see the development of the iron and steel industry, we see the development of the communications industry. The telegraph is the important communications industry at this point, and telegraph wires march right next to the railroad tracks across the United States.
What the railroads did, in very short summary, was to bring raw materials to where they might be developed or processed, to take processed goods to customers, to take people into farmlands. So you have foodstuffs traveling in one direction and materials traveling in the other direction.
The railway is the greatest centralizing force of modern times.
Between 1869 and 1894, 100,000 miles of railroad track were laid, the infrastructure for an industrial society, financed by Eastern bankers and lubricated by the brand new industry of refined petroleum. Oil was the fuel of the future, and John D. Rockefeller was its leading producer.
Rockefeller understood, like many of the leading industrialists of his age, that large-scale production would generate returns and efficiencies that the small-scale investment simply could not.
The major goal the Standard Oil has is to eliminate competition, to ruthlessly streamline production, and to make it as efficient as possible. Basically, you have a choice with Standard Oil. You join them or you die.
One of the advantages that he brought to the oil market was order, structure, pricing, efficiencies, and so on. Of course, the disadvantage was that once he created a monopoly through his efficient and orderly business practices, then he could do anything he wanted with the prices.
Rockefeller wasn't the only industrialist who understood the advantages of monopoly.
In his mid-60s, the Commodore set his sights on the New York Central Railroad, which extended from Buffalo to Albany, up to the Great Lakes, out to the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. This was something much bigger than he could purchase on his own. So he tried negotiating with the board of directors of the New York Central to work out some arrangement. It was getting nowhere. So what he did, he decreed that his Harlem and Hudson lines would not connect with the New York Central. So passengers would have to walk through the ice and snow the 2 miles to make that hookup, and the freight would have to be hauled across the 2 miles. And of course the Hudson River itself was frozen in that hard winter, and the steamships were of no use. So he really brought trade and commerce to a halt at that period. And within a month or two, the New York Central capitulated and said, what are your terms? What do you want from us?
Vanderbilt's consolidated railroad system transported over 7 million passengers per year, with over 9,000 freight cars carrying much of the nation's produce, raw materials, and manufactured goods. He was proud of his role in revolutionizing the nation's transportation system, and he ran his railroad as he pleased.
You don't suppose you can run a railroad in accordance with the statutes of New York, do you?
Government officials and judges generally believed that the less interference there was in the affairs of industry, the better. A laissez-faire capitalism claimed that regulation would only hinder the free hand of the market, which naturally served to foster competition and balance the interests of producers and consumers. But even where ideology didn't suffice, the awesome abundance of money was often enough to keep government off the backs of corporations.
The Gilded Age becomes a sort of golden age of American corruption because so much of these industries really demanded on a cooperation between government and industry. What these industrialists are interested in is not running the whole government. They're just interested in that part of it that can make them wealthy. And what they do is they cultivate friends. Sometimes it's really hard to tell whether public officials are working for the public or whether they're working for corporations. The corruption is, I think, very deep-seated, and it creates the modern corporate lobby whose legacy we live with still.
There were many who criticized the greed and corruption of the era, like Mark Twain, who dubbed it the Gilded Age for its shallow values and published an open letter to the Commodore pleading,
Go, oh, please go, and do one worthy act.
But many more admired the wealthy capitalists, respected their boldness, and were enchanted with their wealth. Where once ordinary Americans had aspired to own their own land, to be free and independent farmers, now their dreams began to change, and visions of vast fortunes danced in their heads.
You may consider yourself engaged at a salary of $10 a week. $10, repeated Dick, thinking he must have misunderstood. It was indeed a bright prospect for a boy who only a year before could neither read nor write.
Horatio Alger's stories of poor boys rising to wealth and respectability were a cultural staple of the late 19th century. What began with his first novel, Ragged Dick, became a genre of rags to riches stories which fed the imaginations of Americans rich and poor.
The stories were very popular at the time precisely because the world that Horatio Alger described in them was disappearing. And the world that he described was the world of small communities where you either had your own business, ideally, or you worked directly under the owner of a business. They also were a way to give people hope. So if you're plucky and a little luck, you may be able to step outside of this industrial morass that most people found themselves in.
The idea that anybody could get rich was one that spread around the world. My own grandfather, when I asked him why his parents had immigrated, he shrugged his shoulders. He said the streets were paved with gold. When my great-grandparents came to the United States, they discovered that the streets were not, in fact, paved with gold. And immigrants found themselves crowded into tenements. They found themselves working in sweatshops. They found themselves not getting rich. And so the myth was indeed a myth, but it definitely kept people coming here, and it kept people striving.
As the disparities between rich and poor grew increasingly conspicuous, new social and religious philosophies sprang up to assuage the conscience of the nation.
Society does not owe any man a living. He has got to fight the battle with nature as every other man has.
The social Darwinists and the American exponent of social Darwinism, William Graham Sumner, really emphasized that individuals could do nothing to change things. Everything happened in a mechanical way. It was the evolution and survival of the fittest.
The principle of social Darwinism is a circular logic, namely that if you are materially successful, by whatever means you became materially successful, you are valued as having individual merit. One of the many unfortunate consequences was that poor people were also presumed to deserve what they, in this case, did not have. And so this meant that even children were judged as unfit by virtue of their poverty.
In his Gospel of Wealth, Andrew Carnegie gave the concept a softer, if more paternal slant.
Carnegie didn't like the way that the rich spent their money, so the Gospel of Wealth was really his statement of how the very rich should operate. And what he said is that the wealthy should be stewards for all of the people. They should see the money not simply as their own money, but use it for the public good.
Carnegie advocated philanthropy, and he himself gave away more than $300 million in his lifetime, most notably for public libraries.
I think he probably had the Vanderbilts in mind when he wrote the Gospel of Wealth. Alva Vanderbilt had given a ball in 1883 that cost in today's currency about $4 million, an elaborate costume ball to promote her launching into high society.
Turned out really to be the ball of the season. It was on the front pages the next day of all the newspapers across the nation. And the guests came dressed in every sort of imaginable costume. One of the Commodore's granddaughters, Alice Vanderbilt, came dressed as the electric light, which was then a new invention, dressed all in satin and with diamonds all over her head as if she was sparkling light.
In the late 19th century, the lights of the city drew Americans in droves, leaving the agricultural or craft work that had brought self-sufficiency for city jobs that paid them in cash.
When we talk about a consumer culture, we're literally talking about a culture in which people buy things rather than making them. Processed foods, first breakfast cereals, canned foods, those sorts of things. But there were also all kinds of new products, flashlights or phonographs, that nobody had ever seen before.
At the core of a consumer culture is the notion that needs are infinite, that they are changeable. For a consumer culture to exist, we have to want more. By the 1890s, you've got a group of people who are beginning to say what we demand is a living wage. We want to be able to buy for our families what it takes to participate in the American culture. And so they are essentially defining what it means to be a man now, not in terms of owning your own business anymore, but in terms of being able to provide for your family within a consumer culture.
One of the things that strikes people by 1890, 1900 is how different the America of their old age or middle age was from the America of their youth. It's an urban nation. It's an industrializing nation. We are a magnet for people all over the world who see the United States as a place where individual lives can be bettered. All of those things are taking place. They come at an incredible cost, because increasingly by the end of the century, the United States for the first time is being divided into a society of people who are rich, there's an emerging middle class, but there are large numbers of poor in ways that seem un-American to many people.
What were the benefits of industrialization in the U.S. case? Simply put, more output and lower prices. Lower prices improve the living standards of individuals and gives them access to a greater array of goods. What are the costs? The introduction of mass mechanized factory production, and this replaces the small workshop and indeed the small-scale farm in the case of agriculture. A way of life is ultimately being eliminated, and it's replaced by what many social historians have regarded as the fairly impersonalized qualities of the large factory, the large corporation. People become numbers, not names.
We oftentimes look back on this rapid industrialization as if this is a wonderful boon to humanity. But the costs for the people at the time were enormous. The costs included the very obvious costs of the workers who worked under horrible conditions. But even the people who we would consider successes during that period paid a price as well. A term that was popular in the 1880s and then through the 1890s was neurasthenia. We would call this stress now. That drove people into anxiety attacks, hysteria, depression, insomnia, and all the things that we now understand as being physiological reactions to stressful situations.
Finally, one of the clear costs of industrialization is environmental. Rapid expansion into the interior of the country, rapid urbanization, is chewing up natural resources and creating pollution and other industrial waste byproducts that are leaving the environment worse off.
Of course, in the 19th century ads, they would show the factories with the smoke coming out. This is good. And now, of course, we would say, oh my gosh, they're polluting. We have to do something about it. So there was a wide range of consequences.
Made about capitalism, about distribution, about the rights of labor.
Who had power in the society, economic power, political power, cultural power.
And the way that power has been challenged by other social groups that have been more excluded from power.
How people in the past struggled to make things at least as good as they are today.
Struggled to become included and in the process have changed the nation.
All of American society, white and black, different ethnic groups, different social classes, were going to have to struggle over what the meaning of freedom was.
That in some ways turns into a question about who gets to be defined as an American and who doesn't, and who does the defining.
Who are Americans?
For me, the key question about the United States emerging from the Civil War is how a country so utterly transforms itself.
How have the lives of Americans changed? Right? Dramatically so.
What are we becoming? What do we want to be? What can we be?
If we looked at the United States at the end of the Civil War now, we would think of it as what we call an underdeveloped country. And the real question is how we got from there to here.
We need to understand how our economy grew to be the biggest and most productive and prosperous in the world.
The way in which industrial capitalism has unfolded.
How we decided to divide the pie, what kinds of decisions we...
What does it mean to be an American?
I think a major theme is the evolution of America's relationship with the wider world.
How does the United States become this global power?
And how does that affect our sense of what it means to be an American?
Maybe one would want to look at our notion of our own exceptionalism.
This idea that we are a special people who formed ourselves on a city on a hill, it seems presumptuous. And yet there's much good in that notion of a people who are making history rather than being imprisoned in it.
I would like to have questions about why this matters, why a historical understanding matters.
If we had to distill it to one thing, it's to remember the very vital presence of the past in contemporary American life, how it shapes the decisions we make and the options that present themselves to us. I think that's the central lesson we want to look at.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The end of the Civil War